I'm Jeremy Roman from the Waterloo office of Google. I'm here to talk about web APIs for next-gen pre-rendering. So if you attended Kinako's talk earlier today, you might be aware that we're looking at bringing pre-rendering back, making it new again, and what we can do for the web. And we think that this might involve exposing some web-facing API and API changes to web developers so that we can work together with web developers to deliver next-generation pre-rendering. So what would you want in next-generation pre-rendering? Well, among other things, you'd want it to be fast and efficient so that it speeds up your experience when conditions permit and doesn't use excessive resources otherwise. Ideally, the browser could tune the network, compute, memory, and other resources available. Tune the behavior to those resources, rather. Ideally, it would be private, consistent with updated privacy models, such as Chrome's Privacy Sandbox. We should be able to get content ready without enabling tracking of users who haven't yet navigated. It should be unobtrusive so that pre-rendered content doesn't exhibit annoying behavior like pop-ups, alerts, permission prompts. Pre-rendered content shouldn't disrupt your experience on the current page. And it should be easy and predictable so that web developers can enable pre-rendering with as little work as possible, but still understand how the browser will behave and have it behave in a manner that's on track for being interoperable across browsers in the long term. So to achieve this, we think we need to work together with developers and make this a web platform feature and not just a web browser feature. We want to apply some behavior changes to content during pre-rendering to achieve some of these objectives. And to avoid breaking content that isn't expecting this, we want developers to opt into being pre-rendered. And finally, we need a trigger for authors to tell the browser what outgoing links the user is likely to visit and which links can be prefetched without side effects. So when it comes to behavior restrictions, one of the most interesting ones is storage restrictions. Consistent with browser privacy models about not allowing access to unpartitioned storage before navigation, we think that cross-origin pre-rendered pages should not be able to access unpartitioned cookies, local storage, and IndexedDB. And they shouldn't be able to use storage adjacent APIs like broadcast channel and shared workers to coordinate with other pages which do have access to that storage and credentials. These APIs, we think, should be either limited or non-functional until the time that the page is navigated. Authors who do need to use these APIs early in their application lifecycle in order to personalize or to add functionality to their pages would need to detect when this functionality becomes available and upgrade their content at that time. So that might mean fetching any resources that require credentials again, or displaying the name of the logged in user if that wasn't known due to lack of credentials. And so we think this would look something like this, where we'd provide something, a promise for the developer to observe when access to uncredentialed storage is available. And at that time, they can update the DOM, initiate new network fetches and whatnot, which would proceed with a full access to credentials. Some other restrictions we think are necessary and that pre-rendering functionality has applied in the past, but that we want to be explicit about is preventing things from doing things like displaying pop-up windows and dialog boxes, initiating downloads, displaying permission prompts, playing audio, or generally doing anything which would require user activation. Where possible, we'd like these APIs to await asynchronously for navigation. So if something, we'd all rather that permission prompts not be shown on load, but to the extent that they can be shown on load, we want it to make it easy for it to happen at the time the developer intended, which is when the page is navigated to. Certain synchronous APIs like window.open and alert can't do that. And so we think that most of these can be quietly blocked in a manner similar to existing pop-up blockers deployed in browsers today. And so this would, you'd write similar code to what you wrote before. Your alert that you, for some reason, fire on page load would be suppressed. Things like requesting the notification permission, to the extent that it doesn't require user gesture, would just be delayed until navigation occurred, which is, we expect a lot of code to be okay with, because it sort of just looks like the user is ignoring the permission prompt until the page is navigated to, which is essentially what they're doing. So opting in, some of these behavior changes, we've tried to make them as minimal as possible, but we think that there are still cases where they would break content. if the content wasn't prepared for it. So, for instance, if you're visiting, a website and you expect to be logged into the website, well, when that's fetched without credentials, you'll seem to be logged out, and you'll think, "What the heck? I thought I was logged in." So, because we don't want content to be blamed for a breakage that isn't really their responsibility, we want content to opt in and say, "Hey, I'm aware of this uncredentialed pre-rendering, and I'm prepared to update my content after I'm loaded uncredentialed, if necessary." So the natural form for this is as a response header that the browser can observe. So it can fetch the resource and see if the resource declares that it supports this. Um, this means the document can be used even if it was fetched without cookies and credentials, if it was fetched from a different location, and will dynamically upgrade itself if the content would have depended on that state. For this to be widely used, because this option is required, we need to make it as easy to adopt as possible. And we've got a significant amount of anecdotal evidence that a significant number of authors find it difficult to deploy HTTP response headers. And since this is a property of the document and we've got some precedent for it, we think that we'll likely want to support declaring this in a meta tag in addition to in a response header. There's some complexity to the processing model for this that we go into in the GitHub proposal, but we think that this makes it a lot easier for authors to adopt, and we think that that's going to be ultimately the bigger deal there. And then that brings us to triggers. So today, pre-rendering is triggered with a link tag like this one. Triggers ultimately are hints to the user agent to do some sort of speculative action. This trigger ends up implying the user is likely to navigate to this URL. Fetching this URL will not have side effects. And pre-rendering the URL is likely to make navigation faster. Like, the users are going to save time by doing this. It's a good idea to do it. This requires the author to make fairly solid determinations about which URLs meet these criteria and lift only the best option into a link element. So they need to figure out which link on their page is the best one, statically or dynamically, and make a link element for that. And they don't have a lot of help from the user agent in doing that, and even when it would have been beneficial for them to do it. Some authors do have very good information about this and can make this determination very solidly. So it's worth thinking about whether we can do better on the triggering side as well. We know from libraries like QuickLink that authors can realize significant gains in some cases if they make more links eligible for pre-rendering. QuickLink uses fairly simple heuristics. I believe it's based on what links are in the page and what's in the viewport and a couple other things, but it's not very complicated. And so it got us wondering, well, what if since we're reimagining a large amount of pre-rendering, what if we use this opportunity to make it as easy as possible to mark everything that's safe to prefetch and pre-render, and share responsibility between the site and the user agent to figure out which links are likely to be clicked on and whether it's a good idea to pre-render under the current conditions. And so the proposal that's currently the sort of draft proposal looks something like this, where an author can define some speculation rules. They can provide a list of URLs like they could with a link tag and say, I believe these URLs are likely to be navigated to and should be pre-rendered, but can also just simply say any links found in the document which match this URL pattern or which match the CSS selector are likely to be pre-rendered, and I'm going to give you like a score of how likely I think those things are to be clicked on. In either case, this allows the author to more easily just put these rules in one place, and as links are added to the document by the server or dynamically at runtime, the user agent can update its expectations about what the user might do without the page needing to be responsible for figuring out which thing it should pre-render. And this sort of lets us, if the site has a very good idea of what the user is going to do, it can share that information with the user agent. But if the site has only a vague idea of what the user is going to do, but has a very good idea of what is safe, then they can share this with us. We do need the participation from the site because we need to know what's consistent with the site's model of privacy of the users about what those outgoing links are, and we need to know what's safe. Especially for same origin URLs, because we don't exclude credentials. we don't want the browser to speculatively click on the login, sort of the logout link on every site that you're on, or the add to cart button, or anything like that, because those would have side effects. And so we need support from the page to tell us which things are still safe, even if we had an oracle for what these was going to do next. And so that sort of breaks down the strategy into 3 parts: behavior changes to make rational, private, predictable pre-rendering; an opt-in for the content to be pre-rendered, indicating that if it's pre-rendered in an uncredentialed way, that it can upgrade itself; and triggers on the referring site in order to make it as easy as possible for authors to have pre-rendering occur for outgoing links on their site. There's some more information available in other sessions at BlinkOn. In the past, you can view a recording of, or maybe you already saw, Kineko's Instant and Seamless keynote, which gives an overview of how this fits into a large strategy. At the same time, you are currently missing Lucas and Carlos's talk about the multi-page architecture, which deals with some of the implementation details about how this will be implemented in Chromium, especially in the browser process. Matt Falkenhagen's going to be giving a talk about pre-rendering from an implementation perspective and talking about how we're using the IPC system and a number of other things to enforce some of these rules. And there's going to be a talk about the back-forward cache, which is essentially the opposite of pre-rendering on day 3. Some more detail about this is available on the GitHub URL on screen right now, and of course we're happy to talk about it. And that's the end of the presentation prepared. I'm happy to take any questions.
Would the HTTP cache basically be like throwaway if you didn't actually end up navigating to it? Or how does that relate to the storage access constraints?
I think that's an interesting question. I suspect we'd have to throw it away. There might be some conditions under which it can be used. I'm not certain. I'm basically worried that there might be some case in which this can be used as a cross-site tracking vector, and that's what I'm trying to make sure isn't possible. That if you put it into, without navigation, you put it into the HTTP cache in a way that's visible to the unpartitioned site, then you might be able to reveal to the unpartitioned site that it had been used in a pre-render that didn't commit, which could be used potentially as a cross-site tracking vector. And so I suspect that in a lot of cases, or maybe all cases, we would need to discard the cache if the paid document did not end up being navigated to. Does anyone else have any other thoughts about this? I know there's a few other people in this channel who have more expertise than me on this.
Yes, so just let me make sure that for semi-origin case, it is don't need to happen, so that like everything you prefetched can be just reused, pre-rendered. For cross-origin cases, as Jeremy mentioned, we are very concerned about potentially it can be used for cross-site tracking, while the resources can be still held in, for example, renders memory cache, like be around for if the navigation happens and the subsequent navigations, they can use it if it's in a same context. Or need to see how all these details need to work, but
I suspect we could keep it around in an isolated cache only to be used for outgoing pre-renders from that same origin, but I'm not sure whether that would be useful enough that we'd want to do it.
That will need to add some complexity. So we will likely start with throwing it away.
There was a question in the chat. Do you have an umbrella issue?
Depends what you mean by issue. like there's the GitHub repository, a CR bug. I don't think we have an umbrella CR bug that covers all of this. There's a CR bug component that covers some of the pre-rendering implementation work. And Portals, which is sort of a follow-on offshoot of this, has its own CR bug component. I'm not aware of a tracking bug for all of this work. Yeah, on the sort of a bunch of this is still early enough that very little code or no code has landed for it in Chromium. And so there are certainly, there's a GitHub repository for tracking the explainer specification work, and there's the YCG proposal issue, but not all of it is reflected into implementation enough to have tracking bugs. Some of it does. Yeah. And there's a bug whose number I'm not going to look up right now that follows the opt-in implementation, I think, because that was required for the intended prototype to Blink Dev. But I don't think there's one universal tracking bug, but there's a couple. And people in chat are sharing a bunch of other useful resources.
Add another question. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. So the cross-origin case, I was wondering, do we think it's reasonably likely to be idempotent in terms of, a cross-origin site? Basically, they're not going to kind of get the same kind of context as like an iframe load where they might say, hey, for this URL, I don't actually want to take some action, but just imagine, like a get parameter might not, be what we actually want to execute, similar to the logout case, but imagine something else. So I was wondering, like, should there be more like a CORS pre-flight, and maybe the meta tag actually isn't workable for cross-origin? You have thoughts on that?
So I would be disappointed if we ended up concluding that certainly something like a CORS pre-flight would be more ironclad, right? Because it guarantees that you don't have some of these side effects. That seems even more difficult than an HTTP response header for authors to deploy. And so my concern with that would be that this would end up being limiting cross-site pre-rendering to only authors who are very sophisticated in their server behavior. The reason that I think this is likely to be okay is that in the cross-site case, we firstly still require some other site to say that this is a good URL to pre-render. And then secondly, the request is made without credentials, which means that it can't possibly be acting on some sort of user-specific information because it's uncredentialed. And so this is a URL that would likely to get queried frequently by web spiders and other agents on the web today, if it did have side effects of that sort. And we are going to send in the request a header that indicates that this is a fetch for pre-rendering. And so servers that nonetheless have non-idempotent behavior do have the option to identify this as a pre-render, not do that behavior, and possibly abort the pre-render if that's necessary for their content. I expect that most content isn't going to need to do that because it's not going to have that sort of side effect, or spiders and other robots on the web today would be hitting it frequently.
There's a good question in the chat. It says pre-rendering efficiency depends on click-through rate very much. Do you plan to track click-through rate and turn off inefficient pre-renders?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the classic pre-render, more or less, did the pre-render if the author asked for it. We have some flexibility here to be a little bit more clever. It's difficult to figure out exactly what the right way to deal with this is. To some extent, anything authors can do to the information they have about click-through rate, if they provide that information in the form of a score or simply not enabling pre-render, that's very helpful. We're looking at what we can do, what user agents can do to identify the content that's worthwhile to pre-render and the content that's not likely enough to be clicked on to be worth pre-rendering. There's a lot of complexity to figuring out what the right strategy is there. For instance, you could imagine, having knowledge about specific sites that's either gathered locally or in aggregate by some sort of a spider or something like that. But you have to be very careful in doing this, that this information is sufficiently useful and that this information respects users' privacy and doesn't end up revealing information about specific users' behavior in a way that would be inconsistent with their privacy objectives. So yes, and in some cases we might be able to, but in some cases the authors might be better positioned to do that. We certainly would be happy to hear any thoughts about what the most effective strategies there you think there would be there are.
Yeah, so my way of answering that question would be, we're not currently at the stage of making such concrete plans, but we are trying to design the infrastructure such that is strategies like that are ones we could deploy without causing side effects or leaking privacy, right? So it's all setting the groundwork, and hopefully once all the groundwork is set, we can experiment with a bunch of different strategies, click-through rate, site speed, index, things like that.
And we here doesn't even necessarily mean just Chromium or just Google Chrome. You might imagine that, like, as a web platform feature, that this enables user agents to take a variety of strategies, and then we can compete to develop what the best strategies are for making these predictions and making these assessments and balancing resources against likelihood of navigation and other things.
I think if you think of it too from the larger perspective that Kanuko presented on earlier about our vision for instant and seamless navigation on the web, I'm sure we don't have the concrete plans yet. I'm sure we will be tracking very closely all of the metrics of how much faster do web pages get, how much additional resources are we using, how obviously pre-rendering is going to slow other things down if there's contention for the CPU and all that sort of thing. So in usual Chrome fashion, we'll be experimenting heavily and trying to tune all of our parameters to maximize the user benefit while minimizing the costs. Is that fair, Jeremy and Kanuko? And that's kind of our MO for any of these kind of optimizations, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We are very much keen to making this efficient, and we'll be watching all the data that's available.
I have a question about triggering. For cross-origin pre-renders, given that you need to opt in to this, do we need both a trigger and an opt-in?
And I think the answer there is yes. So we don't want we want someone to indicate some reason to indicate that this is going to be a request that's likely to succeed. If no one believes this request is likely to succeed, we can, we're likely to do a lot of fetches for pages which aren't going to end up having opted in. And the second thing is that the fact that this outgoing URL exists, there's going to be a fetch for this URL. The fact that this outgoing URL exists may, under some sites' privacy models, not be an acceptable bit of information to release. And therefore, those sites may not wish for that pre-render to occur, and we'd prefer not to initiate those fetches unless we had some reason to believe that it was both likely to be useful and likely to be consistent with the privacy objectives of the user and of the author.
Right. I will note the explainer currently says it's not required. Triggers are not required for cross-origin pre-rendering. So I know the explainer lags behind a little bit, but we might want to synchronize on that. Yeah.
Okay, you'll have to point me at that because I don't remember the explainer saying that. It's possible that the explainer in my head disagree.
I mean, the explainer is like a little vague about it, but that's basically, I guess, it. I'll put it in the Slack channel for a little more persistence. I should also mention the explainer is not fully up to date with all the restrictions. Like currently it says just all permission requiring APIs are blocked, but over the last week or so, we've developed a more nuanced understanding about trying to delay certain things.
Yeah, and generally a lot of our stuff in this space is very actively work in progress. And so we try to say what the most up-to-date version of our current thinking is, but very much work in progress and open for discussion. All right, if there are no more questions and we're at about 4:30, I guess we can call it. Thank you very much.